Dear colleagues, dear members of the audience, we are beginning the panel session. You know the agenda, but in order to continue our work, we must make a 5-minute break. Dear colleagues, we are continuing our panel session. Thank you. I'm sorry for the delay. So, the thesis is to be defended under the specialization 080001, Inflation Regulation in Modern Russia, Institutional Approach. The candidate for the defense is Margarita Repina. We have a quorum, so we can start our panel session. Please switch off your mobile phones. I also want to say that the defense procedure is being recorded and broadcast on the internet and interpreted into English. Under the federal law, as of May the 23rd, 2016, St. Petersburg State University and Moscow State University are entitled to confer academic degrees. The degrees are conferred only within the specializations and branches of science specified by the Russian Ministry of Science and Education. So the corresponding order on the procedure of granting academic degrees at St. Petersburg State University was issued on the 1st of September 2016. The current session of the dissertation is held in accordance with the order 10182/1. The session is valid providing 2/3 of the appointed board members are present. All the members of the board are present, therefore we have a quorum and we can begin the panel session. Now a few words about our agenda. So the session of the dissertation board cannot exceed 2 hours. The agenda is as follows. The chairman's presentation about the documents submitted by the candidate for the degree and their conformity with the requirements. Chairman's reply to the questions, if any. The candidate's presentation providing an overview and findings of the research, no more than 15 minutes. Questions to the candidate regarding the presentation, no more than 2 minutes for each question. Reports on the thesis. The board members will be taking the floor in turns in order to give a detailed account of their opinions, suggestions and questions, no more than 5 minutes per person. Then the candidate's comments about the reports on the thesis, no more than 10 minutes. Questions from the audience. The members of the audience can ask their questions. The candidate's comments about the talks given by non-members of the board, no more than 5 minutes. Presentation of the candidate's thesis supervisor, no more than 3 minutes. Then we'll have a 5-minute break before the open balloting. And the last item on the agenda is the candidate's closing speech. This is all I can say about our agenda for today. Are there any questions? Okay, now let's proceed with our agenda. I must say a few words about the document submitted by Margarita Repina. So the topic of the thesis is Inflation Regulation in Modern Russia, Institutional Approach. It was accepted for the defense on the 12th of October 2017. The academic board was set up also by the order of the academic secretary. Here are the board members. Professor Viktor Timofeev, professor of St. Petersburg State University, Professor Nikolai Lyakin from St. Petersburg State University, Professor Vasiliev Labudin of the St. Petersburg State Forest Technical University, Professor Irina Shvets from the Institute of Control Science, and Professor Konstantin Golubev from the Belarus State Economic University. So the candidate for the degree has submitted an application in the name of the rector, Professor Nikolai Mukropachev. She submitted the application on the 12th of September 2016. A report of the supervisor submitted by Nikolai Dubyansky. List of published works which describe the research findings, including 4 academic papers which have been published in peer-reviewed journals recommended by the Ministry of Education and Science. Letter of verification certifying that she has passed the qualifying exams in economic theory, history and of philosophy and foreign language. Copy of the university diploma issued by St. Petersburg State University, registration number 2031197. The degree was issued with the specialization of the economist, thesis in Russian and English, a printed version with a manuscript copyright and a digital copy. The thesis formatting and reference list comply with the state standard. I must say that the above-mentioned documents comply with item 12 of section 3 of the order on the procedure of granting academic degrees at St. Petersburg State University. This is what I must say about the documents submitted for the defense. Are there any questions? Now let's proceed with our agenda. I give the floor to Margarita Repina.
Good afternoon, dear colleagues. Let me present for defense my dissertation. The topic of my dissertation is Inflation Regulation in Modern Russia, Institutional Approach. There are 4 topics to my 4 parts to my presentation: novelty, purpose, relevance, research findings, major conclusions and recommendations. Let's start with the relevance of the research topic. Inflation is one of the most debatable topics in the economic theory. There are thousands of pages devoted to this issue. Currently, however, there is not a consistent theory of inflation which can explain the versatility of this phenomenon. The lack of a proper approach to inflation and transmissional mechanism thereof the central bank entails mistakes in the regulatory policy. The transfer to the transmission targeting entails the necessity to really understand the new conditions in which this policy is conducted and the formation of proper institutional environment. What makes the research even more relevant is the lack of proper evaluation of the factors which affect the inflation regulation. So let me briefly go over the purpose and novelty of this work. The purpose of this research is to form a systematic institutional approach to the inflation regulation in Russia under the modern terms and conditions. The scientific novelty is in the comprehensive analysis of the inflation reasons in the Russian Federation in the period from 2005 and 2015, and development of a systematic institutional approach to the inflation regulation in terms of the special role in this process of the imbalances in the monetary system and impact of the money supply indigeneity. Let me focus on the research findings. Number 1, inflation in modern Russia is of an institutional nature, but is implemented in practice through different forms of the supporting monetary emission. First of all, let me give you a few words, an overview of institutional factors that the institutional economic theory determines. New institutional economic theory determines 2 groups of factors. The first group of factors has an impact on institutional environment. These such factors as the indigeneity of money and the degree of independence of the central bank. The second group of factors is the monopolization of the economy and transaction costs. Here we deal with economic agents. In fact, this is the macroeconomic level. There are several key reasons for the inflation in Russia. Each of them is in fact an institutional factor I have determined. The first one is the comprehensive ineffectiveness of the banking system in Russia, along with the high level of indigeneity of money. This ineffectiveness entails inflation. There is a certain deformation in the economic structure of Russia, which leads to the creation of an economic impulse, which affects the regulation of costs. Another factor is the level of independence of the Central Bank of Russia. Money emission also affects inflation in Russia. The Russian Federation cannot create a proper economic environment, which also results in high inflation. Now let me focus on the financial and economic model which I developed within my study. So this model underlines the importance of institutional factors which entailed inflation over the period from 2005 to 2015. There is a breakdown into two periods. The first period is from 2005 to 2010. So the first period is characterized by significant money growth. I think it's more important to focus on the second period. It's an after-crisis period. Here I mean the 2008 crisis, which entailed changes in policy, and here we see some interesting results in the endogenous channel. So here we see growth in assets, in banking assets, and growth in interest rates. The coefficients are 57 and 51% respectively, which shows a high level of indigeneity. So now let me focus on the second research finding about the high level of endogenous money supply and how it affects inflation. Indigeneity and inflation lies in the correlation of banking and the market. This is about providing credits, financial innovations. This slide shows the general pattern of how it's implemented in Russia. There are two groups of prerequisites which allow the high level of indigeneity to create inflation. The first one is the low marginal level of the banking sector. So this is the lack of prerequisites for the systemic growth of the banking sector in the Russian Federation. We have been witnessing that for several years. The credit resource is getting more and more expensive, making it impossible for most economic agents to obtain that. It affects mostly small and middle businesses. Companies invest in major assets. The slide shows the graph. 50% falls on the company's own assets. Companies in general have low level of profitability. What companies do in other countries, they transfer costs from investments into the price, which creates inflation. At the same time, we are witnessing huge growth of the assets in the banking system. So this is basically true for such sectors as metallurgy, mining, oil and gas. Endogenous emission is growing. It makes the inflationary impulse stronger and a more speedy inflation. We are now focusing on the third research finding about the deformity of the sectoral structure of the economy of the Russian Federation. This is logically connected with the second channel. The imbalance in the structure of the Russian economy from the point of view of the dominance of the extractive industries affects the cash flow in the Russian economy. So the fact that we have positive trade surplus can make the ruble-to-dollar exchange rate stronger. So, for example, in parity purchasing power, the exchange rate of 22 rubles per dollar is impossible, because in this case companies will not be able to compete with other companies in terms of export. During the crisis time in 2008 and 2009 and in 2014 and 15, this was widely used by the Bank of Russia. The exchange rate of the dollar increased approximately twofold. At the moment, the Bank of Russia does not resort to these measures, but at the same time, they can use this tool if need be. The monetary policy is reviewed every year, and the central bank reserves the right to resort to this policy. It's important to understand that this money is distributed in the economy unevenly. In the fuel and energy complex, there is a high degree of concentration. About 30% of Russia's GDP falls on the 10% of largest company in Russia. 6 out of them are fuel and energy companies. In general, for the energy complex in Russia, low competition is typical. We used to have more small businesses in this sector. Now, the number of small players is getting smaller and smaller. So the enormous revenues received from the export of national resources fall into the hands of a limited range of economic agents, and the excess money supply leads to inflation due to the one-sidedness of the Russian economy. In such conditions, we can explain that on the position of the theory of sticky information. Mankiw and Gregory continue developing this theory. The logic of the model is that information about relative prices is distributed in the economy unevenly. As a result, most firms make conclusions to change the prices upon some old information. So the inflationary impulse which appears in one sector of economy, which are more profitable and more effective, it starts in these companies and then it develops on to capture other companies. The stronger the companies are, the stronger the volatility of these phenomenon is. My final research finding is about the independence of the Bank of Russia and how it affects inflation. The economic and legal analysis of the Bank of Russia has showed that it's not performing effectively. I have calculated the index of independence of Alex Zuckerman. The research showed that the index is falling. It fell from 0.52 to 0.44. There is no direct correlation between M2 and consumer price index. However, this index can show how changes in the independence can affect inflation. Low expectation, low level.
Currency intervention may also play an important role here, because this is the conditions the banking system is existing in today. Now I would like to move to the to some major conclusions.
So the first group of recommendations concerns the restructuring of the financial sector. So the banking and credit organizations have to be equally distanced from the central bank. The second group of recommendations will make a positive impact on the deformation of the sectoral structure. So here we offer the implementation of dynamic investment policy, a set of measures to make companies more competitive in different sectors. Here we mean first of all the transformation of the performance of the federal agency. Then we speak about the implementation of special financial investment instruments. In the current conditions, the only possible way out is conduct comprehensive and systematic anti-inflationary policy to shape effective money power lies in the transformation of major financial institutions. The key effects of all the conducted measures is the lower level of inflation rate in Russia to make it more stable, to make it more stable in the 21st century.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions to the candidate for the degree? Professor Labudin. Thank you. It was a very interesting presentation. I have two questions. How can you assess the weight of each factor in the inflation? And my second question is as follows. Some people believe that our economy is not saturated with money. We have lack of money. Some people say that the shortage is 30%, and which is lower than in developed countries. So how can you assess this opinion? Thank you. Are you going to answer the questions now? Okay, I'm going to answer the questions right now. So as for the factors, I would like to refer to the calculations that I've made. From the point of view of the modeling, I can say that the major source of inflation, these are factors that lead to indigeneity, like the ineffective banking system. There are three main factors that I'm speaking about in my thesis, and the major factor is the endogenous emission, which is done through the banking sector. And the direct influence can be seen here. It accounts for 50 or 60%. But I would like to say that the reasons I've been speaking about work in tandem. Without such reasons as the central bank, which cannot create an effective environment, and without the deformity of the industry system, the indigenous channel would not have such a big impact. So I can speak about the balance of these factors. As for a second question about the monetary coefficient, which is equal to 30% according to some opinions, I was planning to include this in my thesis, and I have some official statistics. The monetary coefficient is more than 30% now. I can say that in our country there is a disbalance of different spheres of money circulation. We have the general sphere of money circulation, which can be assessed through general money indicators. But this money account for 30% of the GDP, and they are not distributed evenly. A large proportion of the money that we have is concentrated on very few economic agents, such as banks and fuel and energy companies. In some areas, the economy is saturated with money, and in some areas, we see a shortage of money. And from this point of view, we are saturated with money. We have another question. So we are going from left to right. I also have two questions. My first question is as follows. So this is the slide that I need. We see that the price for oil has a negative correlation with inflation. Is that right? Then you showed how the monopolization of the economy is connected with the inflation, and you showed the positive correlation with the high price for oil. Don't you think that there's some controversy here? Because in this case you would have a positive coefficient. And on your slide we see another picture. The layout that we see further on the slide shows the following thing. There is a time lag here. The model ignored the time lag, and it ignored the time lag relation to the price oil. As a result of the currency intervention of the central bank, were not taken into account when there was an upsurge of price oils. So if we had taken the time lag into account, then we would have had different figures. Did you take into account the time lags at all? Sometimes I took the time lags into account, sometimes I didn't. M2X we calculated with the time lag, therefore we had a higher coefficient. Now, my next question is connected with the first one. You've just said that while speaking about the factors of inflation, we say that indigenous money supply account for 60%. When you speak about the money stock, the picture is different. If the indigenous money supply does not depend on the policy of the central bank, then why should we analyze the problems connected with the central bank, since inflation is not controlled by the central bank, and since inflation is determined by the banking system in general? Thank you for your question. I believe that the central bank plays a key role in pursuing the ineffective banking policy, and it creates this ineffective banking system which leads to inflation. Here I speak about the ineffective regulation, which means active financing of top banking, absence of tough, strict regulations regarding different banks. These factors prove that the central bank does not create institutional environment to make active competition among different banks. Therefore, the banks do not finance our economy. And my last question is as follows. It means that the central bank has not been changing any interest rates and has not been changing the money stock. Does it mean that these measures were ineffective and that the central bank did not change the inflation process due to these measures, because the inflation was going on before that and due to the ineffective banking system in general? I mean the years when the refinancing rate was very high, when the banks did not take any loans from the central bank. And it was very unprofitable to take loans. How is this connected with the inflation? If we look at your model, it means that the central bank resorted to some ineffective measures during those 2 years. Is that right? Recently, the policy pursued by the central bank has changed because the head of the central bank has changed. And now we see some positive measures taken by the central bank. But if we suppose that there is a financial shock which comes from the outside, then the central bank will not be able to pursue any effective policies and to resort to any measures that can regulate inflation, because transmission channels of its monetary policy do not work effectively. And this is connected with the fact that the Bank of Russia does not provide any competition. Are there any other questions? I have a question. So you speak about the indigeneity of the money supply. Can you say that the money supply is exogenous? Why do you think so? Exogeneity is determined by the influence of the money stock and the influence of the central bank on the general money supply. When we calculated the statistical significance, we found out that it was not significant, so we did not take it into account. Thank you for your answer. Are there any other questions to the candidate for the degree? No questions. Now you can take a seat. Let's move on to the report on the thesis. I would like to say that all the members of the dissertation board have submitted their reports in due time, and we will be very brief, and we will speak only about critical remarks and some major points of the reports. Let's follow the list that we have in the order. Since I'm the chairperson, I would like to start.
Talking about the relevance of the research topic, then if I give the top 10 dissertations in this topic, then this dissertation will hit this rating and become number 1. The research answers all the major challenges posed by the internal and external economic policy. I'm not going to go through all the points again, because much has been said. I'd like to focus on the novelty of the dissertation and give an overview of the critical remarks I've noticed then when analyzing this dissertation. So talking about the novelty, the candidate has developed a classification of approaches to inflation regulation, which recognizes the role of the central bank. It focuses on the objectives and approaches. It gives both theoretical and practical relation of the process that take place in Russia. Based upon the correlation and regression analysis of inflation factors in modern Russia, the candidate has determined major components and key reasons of inflation in the period from 2005 to 2015. Among these factors are the ineffectiveness of the banking sector at the backdrop of money supply indigeneity and deformity of the sectoral structure of the economy, which creates inflationary impulse. The candidate has conducted the independent analysis of the level of independence of the Bank of Russia, which based on the Zuckerman's index that was conducted for the Central Bank of the Russian Federation. The candidate has provided economic grounds of the legal concept of monetary power in view of providing the effectiveness of the central bank as an institution. She gives well-grounded recommendations to transform the Bank of Russia to conduct effective anti-inflationary policy. Now let me focus on the debatable issues and critical remarks. The research is really interesting and deep, so it's only natural that there are some remarks like that. So the first one, analyzing the role of the central bank, the candidate focuses solely on the monetary aspects. The major area of improvement is enhancing the bank's independence along with the implementation of public control. So here, as an example, we can. So the question is, what does the candidate think about some extra additional benchmarks which can be used to assess the performance of the central bank. The candidate has analyzed anti-inflationary regulation in the modern period. She didn't focus on the Soviet economy. In those days, prices remained stable for a longer period of time due to price regulation and the control under the price stability. In 2017, the forecast for the inflation was 4%. However, current estimate is that it will be 2.7% only. How can the candidate account for this lower inflation rate and how stable it might be? How can she explain that in view of the identified weaknesses, taking into consideration the current level of independence of the central bank? Should the inflation rate be adjusted to 6 to 7%? The dissertation doesn't analyze how the isolation of the financial sphere with its profiteering, how can that affect anti-inflationary policy? The thesis of Margarita Repina complies with the major requirements, and so she has all the possible knowledge and skills to be able to tackle this important issue, and she can be awarded the academic degree in the economic theory.
Dear colleagues, I'll try to be within the time limit. The report is posted on the website, and there are some points where we see eye to eye with the previous speaker. I am not going to speak about the relevance, because inflation has been a very important economic problem in Russia. As for the novelty, I can say that this is one of the few theses which focuses on the institutional reasons for inflation, and the topic itself seems very interesting. Besides, the candidate for the degree was able to identify the institutional reasons for the inflation. And the candidate for the degree also focuses on the lack of independence of the central bank. As a result, the central bank does not set up any regulations for the inflation. The next aspect I would like to speak about is the use of the concept of the Indigenious money supply. This allowed the author to show that the resource for the excessive money supply is not only the actions of the central bank, but also the ineffective banking policy which generates money supply through its activities. As a result, the money supply does not correspond to the economic requirements. I would like to focus on some research findings. First of all, the author substantiates the statement that the central bank is dependent on the executive power. I think it's important to highlight. She has calculated the Schumann index, which proves that the central bank is dependent on the executive power. Moreover, inflation targeting is accompanied by the increase of this dependence. Therefore, the central bank cannot be able to regulate anti-inflationary policies effectively. In the thesis, the author also speaks about the money power, which she regards as one of the powers. This is something that can influence monetary policy and so on. The monetary power is a dependent one. Therefore, we see the creation of an ineffective banking system, and as a result, we also see the inflationary processes which are not dependent on the actions of the central bank. This allows the author to develop the idea that we should set up a body which can control the central bank and develop the strategic approach as well. Here I must say that this body must take care not only of the inflation, but also should control and supervise the sustainable development of the Russian economy. The author also shows that these disproportions lead to the inflationary impulse, because the price leap has an impact on the economy on the whole. The author says that there is an interdependence between the endogenous money supply and institutional reasons for inflation, which are connected in their turns with the ineffectiveness of the central bank. As a result, we see the expansion of the monetary supply. However, I would like also to add that the author gives a very detailed review and analysis of the theoretical works. She makes use of different economical theoretical works. I would like also to highlight that she gives a detailed analysis of the transmission mechanisms related to different changes in the money supply. So her research findings are in line with the specialization economic theory. The credibility of her results is proved by the methods of research. She is familiar with the theoretical works in this area. Now I am moving on to the critical remarks and some inaccuracies. Frankly speaking, I don't know why the author uses the distribution understanding of the inflation. Inflation is the reduction of monetary purchasing power arising in the process of redistribution of public income as a result of the conflict between the state and the population. It means that central bank, as part of the state, can take decisions about the expansion of the money supply and to make a decision to increase the money supply, which leads to the inflation income. The author, however, shows that the inflation income does not always arise, because seigniorage is not always connected with inflation tax. So the inflation tax is something which always accompanies the conflict between the public and the state, and these taxes collected without the consent of the public. I'm afraid every tax is collected without the consent of the public. There is a famous quotation which says the consent of the public to elect parliament is equal to its consent to pay taxes. Therefore, it was impossible, for example, to calculate the Russian budget without the taxes. I'm afraid we shouldn't speak about inflation in terms of the redistribution concept. I don't think it's really necessary, because in the thesis the author speaks about the interaction between the banking system and inflation and other systems. My second point. The author shows that the indigenous money supply results from the changing of the banking technology and different other things. Therefore, the expansion of money supply results from the increase of money bank and also results from the money multiplier. However, the author says that the indigenous money supply is the major inflationary factor. And the author also writes about the concept of the saturated money. I'm referring to the monetary coefficient. She blames the central bank for the low monetary coefficient, but I think we should blame the commercial banks, not the central bank, for the low monetary coefficient, since the central bank cannot influence the money multiplier. The third point, here I'm speaking about the dependence of the loan rate and the inflation rate. So the interest rate is connected with the expenses, therefore we should take the costs into account. But here I think we should come to another conclusion. If we take into account that the interest rate is a nominal interest rate, then the calculations should be different. This correlation coefficient is significant only in periods which are not characterized by stability. Therefore, we have an autocorrelation. If we see the increase of the inflation rate, then we see that this index goes higher. So we do not know what depends on what here. So, but I would like to say that despite all the inaccuracies, the thesis by Margarita Repina conforms with the major requirements, and she can be granted the degree of the candidate of economics. Now the floor is given to Professor Labudin. Now I have pointed out 4 aspects which refer to the novelty. First of all, the author gives a detailed account of the role of the central bank in the inflationary processes and the regulation. The central bank is regarded as the major institution which can regulate inflation. The author gives a detailed account and analysis of different inflationary factors in the second decade of the 21st century. And we have not seen such detailed research before. The third point, here we see an original analysis of the independency of the central bank. This is the first time we have seen such analysis conducted in reference to our central bank. The author gives specific recommendations on the regulation of the inflation in the company in Russia. For example, the increase of the effective activities of the central bank, the increase of its independence, and also public control of the actions of the central bank. And I also think that the major statements and arguments can be sent to the central bank, to the appropriate committee of the State Duma of the Russian Federation, and to the administration of the president, so that the statements can be used. However, the thesis still has some drawbacks. First of all, the author ignores the social aspect. For example, she doesn't speak about the social interests of the state power when she analyzes the measures undertaken by the central bank which are designed to prevent the strengthening of the ruble, she should have spoken about the power, about the fact that the Russian powers exert influence on the extractive companies. Speaking about the situation in the United States, she should have spoken about the interests of the financial capital, which determine the stance of the United States. My second point, speaking about the real independence of the central bank, the author should have spoken about the dependence of the central bank on international financial institutions and on the international financial capital, which dates back to 1992. Without providing a solution to this problem, it's impossible to make the Central Bank of Russia independent. My third point, when speaking about the industry deformation of the economy is one of the major reasons for inflation, the author should have spoken about the high level of monopolization and should have given the appropriate data. It would have made her proposals more specific. Finally, I would like to say that I have one technical remark. There are many tables and graphs in the thesis. She should have included them in an appendix, because in this case it would have been easier to read the paper. However, the critical remarks still allow me to say that the thesis complies with the major requirements set forth in order on the procedure of granting academic degrees in St. Petersburg State University, and she can be awarded the degree of the candidate of economics.
Now the floor goes to Professor Irina Shvets. The dissertation we are discussing today is making an important contribution into the development of issues in the of institutional development, about the state policy, the role of the central bank, and the candidate has really done a good job here. She has regarded the major factors which influence the role of the central bank, and there are really many important issues she raises, but I don't want to repeat my colleagues. Many of them have already reviewed these advantages of the dissertation. I would like to focus my report today on some disadvantages that this work has. So the dissertation would definitely benefit from the development of the institutional model of anti-inflationary regulation based upon exogenous and endogenous factors. The candidate has conducted correlation and regression analysis of the development of inflation in Russia for the period from 2005 to 2015. However, the candidate has not proposed a model to evaluate the suggested anti-inflationary measures. The candidate regards three approaches to reform the system of monetary power: a return to the gold standard, transaction to the system of private money, independence of the central bank with a higher level of public control. Today, as one of my colleagues mentioned today, an important role is given to globalization. The market is becoming globalized, and it would be interesting to focus on these influences. Influences on the Russian economy, the state policy, because this affects the activity of the central bank and on the formation of quasi-monetary systems we are witnessing these days. Is it justifiable to regard as novel the estimation the candidate provides on the independence of the Bank of Russia, which is based on the Zuckerman's calculation of the index for the period of from 2002 to 2015, and the comprehensive analysis of causes of inflation in the Russian Federation? The dissertation is written at a high level. It is really professional, and Margarita Repina can be awarded the academic degree of the candidate of economics. Thank you. Now the floor is given to Professor Golubev.
Good afternoon. I'll try to be brief and keep within the time limit. So the thesis is relevant, and we have spoken several times about it. I agree with the opinion of my colleagues. So the issue of inflation has a very big impact on the life standard of each person and on the economy in general. So the main research findings are also important. Margarita Repina has conducted an analysis of inflation regulation in terms of its dependence on the central bank. She has given a detailed analysis of different reasons for inflation. She has calculated the Sukerman index and has developed some recommendations. Now, a few words about her critical remarks. Her classification of approaches to inflation is not substantiated. The author speaks about three groups of the definitions of inflation. I don't think that we should regard the Great Soviet Encyclopedia as a reliable source in modern times. On page 20, the author says that according to McConnell, any growth of prices is inflation, and the author regards this approach as inaccurate and gives another definition, according to which a steady and long-term growth of the general price level can be regarded as inflation. I don't think this can be applied to the textbook by McConnell, because in the first edition, McConnell wrote about the general increase of prices. And the statement that the conflict between the state and the public at macroeconomic level is not substantiated. It is not clear why the author failed to mention the monopolies, and there was a question referring to this critical remark. The second chapter has the following statement: the central bank is the only natural product of the banking business. It is not evident that the large income of a limited number of people is the reason for inflation. And the author should have explained this statement in order to give a better explanation of the statement. There are also some misprints, so she should have proofread her thesis. In general, I can say that the report is posted on the website. Despite these inaccuracies and drawbacks, the research findings and recommendations formulated in the thesis are credible and substantiated. They have an element of scientific novelty and relevance. Her research findings and conclusions can be used in teaching various courses. Therefore, the thesis by Margarita Repina, Inflation Regulation in Modern Russia, Institutional Approach, complies with the major requirements set forth in Order number 6821/1, and the candidate for the degree can be awarded the academic degree of the candidate of economics. The specialization is 080001, economic theory. Now, thank you. And now I would like to ask Margarita Repina to give her comments about the critical remarks. I would like to start with the questions posed by Professor Rizanov. The first question was about the indicator of the balanced economic role into the calculations, and if this can be applied for Russia. I think that the economic targets and stable prices exclude each other. If we speak about the independence of the central bank, then the targeting aspect is the major aspect for the calculation of the independence. And this can lead to a low level of independence. And here we have an example of the Federal Reserve of the United States. The United States experience shows that there are some negative consequences. And there are some aspects that can be controlled only to a limited extent. And at the moment, there is no necessity to include economic targeting into the targets of the central bank, because in this case the executive power would be able to exert power on the central bank. The second question was about the fact that I underestimate the anti-inflationary measures in Soviet times and the use of the consumer rubles and investment rubles. I agree that this approach is really relevant, because we see very large structural imbalances. And this approach is important to analyze the crisis of 2008, when we witnessed the refinancing of commercial banks exceeding 6 trillion rubles per year. And there were no any restrictions on the process. If there had been some legislative regulations on using this money for direct investment, then we would have seen two channels, investment channel and consumer channel. As a result, we would not have such negative consequences for the economy, and we will deal with this issue in the future. The third issue was about the fact that recently we have seen the inflation level of 2.7%, and the thesis speaks about the inability to reach the inflation level of 4%. So how can I explain this low level of inflation that we currently see? And I would like to say that when we formulated this statement, we meant increase of consumers' income. And the target was 4% because the forecasts were higher. But now we have a lower level of inflation because there is a big decrease in household incomes. The consumer purchasing power has been going down for 3 years. The real salaries have gone down, the nominal salaries have not changed, and so on. But the consumer price index is the same. So it does not seem expedient to change the adjustment to 6%. But at the beginning of 2016, there were some optimistic forecasts, and the figure of 4% seemed unattainable. However, if we achieve an economic growth at a high level, then the 4% is not adequate. but we shouldn't adjust the figure at that moment. I would like to say that there are some issues regarding the methods of calculating the consumer price index, and the methods were changed in 2016. As a result, the inflation rate was downgraded. If we take the previous calculations methods of the consumer price index, then the inflation rate would have been higher. Besides, the sampling included only city dwellers and balanced markets, as well as specific shops. For example, retail chains were not included in the sampling, and it distorts these statistics. Now about the I would like to move to the next issue. Now, questions from Professor Lyakin. The first question was about the redistribution conflict and if it is relevant in modern conditions. Does the state has its own interests which are different from those of the public? In my opinion, there is a conflict here, and this is a fundamental conflict within the framework of the branches of power. There are three branches of power which allow us to eliminate the conflict. Can we regard the collection of taxes as a social conflict between the state and the public? Here I would like to say that there is no adequate system of public control. Therefore, we can say that we would like to answer in the positive. This conflict was especially acute in 1990s. In those times, the country violated the rights of people. As for the seigniorage, I can say that seigniorage leads to the incomes of society, and it is different from the inflation income. Seigniorage may reach up to 30%, and it is quite high even in developed countries. Here it is important to say that there are two channels giving loans to central banks from the government and giving loans to commercial banks by the central bank. But this principle is always violated because there is a conflict here. Because normal loans are usually paid back, but most banks did not pay back their loans to the central bank. The savings bank paid back its loan, but some other banks didn't. And if we have an institutional environment in which the central bank is not controlled by the public, the redistribution conflict takes place. And it is an underlying principle of the inflation. I will speak about the social aspects a bit later. The next question was about the monetary coefficient, which is low, and it is the central bank which is blamed for the low monetary coefficient. I've already mentioned in my presentation, the central bank creates the ineffective institutional environment which leads to indigeneity and inflation in our country. Therefore, we cannot say that it does not influence in this area and that it does not have any leverages to change the situation. Therefore, its contribution is connected with the environment which it creates. Now, the question about the interest rate and the necessity to make calculations through the deflator. We based our model on the consumer price index because we have all the necessary data for each month, but we have data regarding the deflator only in terms of each quarter. But in future we can make the calculations using the deflator. And we will conduct the test assessing the reason and the consequence. Now, questions from Professor Labudin. He says that I should have written about the extractive companies and their role in inflation. On page 147, I speak about the fact that the central bank makes a decision under the influence of extractive companies and does not make the Russian ruble stable. And these extractive companies are usually state-run companies. Therefore, it is connected with the influence of the state. The next question was about the influence of international financial institutions. Thank you for the comment. As for the international financial institutions, I believe that their role transforms the global system of monetary power. And when I speak about the third way to develop the central bank according to the Independency model, here I can say that the International Monetary Fund is independent of the politics, and they should change internally and also exert influence on the central banks of the appropriate countries. As for the industry defamation, I would like to say that regarding the fuel and energy complex, I have spoken about it in my presentation. As for the technical and critical remarks, I would like to thank you for them. Now, questions from Professor Schwitz. She recommends to develop an institutional model of regulation. We give some measures, and they are all related to the institutional approach, and they can be regarded as an institutional model of inflation regulation. Here I'm referring to the independence of the central bank, about the restructuring of the financial center, and so on, because it is connected with the responsibility of the central bank for the creation of the favorable environment. But I agree that I should have given some calculations and built the model which allows us to assess these factors. We are planning to do that in the future. Then there was an interesting question about the role of the financial institutions. I have already commented on it. And the second issue was about the influence of quasi-money systems on the global inflation. How can we take these systems into account? In general, when we were regarding the transformation of the monetary system, here I mean the public, I'm referring to private money, and we mentioned the cryptocurrency. Therefore, I can say that the currency to be used in daily transactions will not pose any threat to the sovereignty of the countries, because the central bank will still regulate the overall monetary policy. And while central banks try to make prices stable, we do not see any reason for cryptocurrency to replace the national currencies. I can give you the following example. Cryptocurrency accounts for less than 0.5% of the money circulation, and it's quite a small figure. I would like to say that cryptocurrency does not perform all the functions typical of the money. They usually are used as savings, and the exchange rate is growing very fast. Therefore, it is normally used for savings. And the consumers of cryptocurrencies are large investment funds. About 4 or 5 investment funds use more than 60% of the cryptocurrency. They just hedge their risks, and that is the case. Moreover, cryptocurrency is not useful for using it for private transactions, because the bank commission is quite high if you cash the cryptocurrency. Cryptocurrency is different from money because it always goes to the end user, and we cannot say that it is comfortable to use something which is less than 1 unit, as is the case with bitcoins. The key contribution to the development of the blockchain technology, which is the underlying principle of the cryptocurrency, is the central bank. For example, the Bank of England is very active in this area, and the central bank is also one of the key investments in the blockchain technology, either themselves or through other banks. The major pilot projects belong, for example, to the savings bank. And if some banks want to replace national currency with cryptocurrency, they will not be able to do this, because central banks will regulate this process. Is it possible to assess the independence of the central bank and say that it is something which is a novelty of the thesis? I can say that this is so because this is the first time we have conducted a similar analysis. We can compare the figure that we have calculated for the Russian bank with the central banks of other countries. And the assessment of the independency of central bank allowed us to identify some factors for the first time. As for the complex analysis of the assessment of the independence of the central bank, allowed us to identify some aspects of inflation. Here I'm referring to the institutional factor and the indigeneity. Now, questions from Professor Golubev. The first question was about the fact that my approaches to inflation were not substantiated. The Greater Soviet Encyclopedia is outdated. We can say so, but I also make reference to a more recent encyclopedia which dates back to 2000. The first group of definitions include inflation, which is typical of the Soviet school of economic thought. This is not a mainstream approach, and we can hardly come across this definition in theoretical works, but I don't think we should ignore this definition because it is still relevant to some extent. The second half of the question was about the incorrect criticism of the textbook by McConnell and Brew, which regards inflation as a general increase in the level of prices. However, the focus is made on the long-term and sustainable growth of the general prices. I don't think that any increase in prices can be regarded as inflation. For example, prices can grow according to different reasons, for example, the increase in its prices or the changes in the economic situation. Here, we should speak about the long-term and sustainable growth in prices. And McConnell and Brew still disregard this factor. I consulted the edition published in 2008, which gives the definition of inflation, according to which inflation is a general increase in the level of prices without the stability and long-term aspects. The next question was about the fact that there is a conflict and between the public and the state, and this statement is not substantiated. I can say that the monopolization has a big influence on the inflation level on our reason, but the inflation is not possible without the emission of money. Therefore, we see a conflict between the state and the public at a macroeconomic level, because the increase of prices for monopolic products will not lead to inflation without the emission of money. For example, if monopolies increase their prices, but we do not have the emission of money, then we see the decrease of the demand. The next question was as follows. We should have proved the following statement. The central bank is a natural product of the banking business. Here, I mean that the emission monopolies in developed countries, except for the United States, were created as a response to different emergency situations. It happened when the state had to get more money into its budget. For example, the Bank of England was created according to a general model. At the first stage, they created a deposit when they took money from different private companies. Then these private companies issued specific papers which functioned as money. I can give you an example of the Bank of England, which was established in 1694. And political turmoil led to this creation. At one point, there was no money in the treasury, so they decided to create an operating company. They passed an appropriate legislative act, and the Bank of England was able to transfer a large amount of money to this company, and it was provided for in the legislative act. The last question was as follows. Large incomes of a limited number of people is the reason for inflation has to be explained. The theoretical explanation of this statement is given in some models, which I describe in my thesis, and I explained the logic behind this in my presentation. When we speak about a limited number of people, I am referring to economic agents and legal entities which still exert demand for fixed assets and for labor force, and it is concentrated within the given sector of the economy. The last question was about the misprints. I would like to thank you for the technical remark. Now you can take a seat. So, are there any questions from the audience?
So are there any questions from the audience before we turn to the general discussion? Now the floor is given to the research supervisor, Professor Dubiansky. I would try to be brief. I have known the candidate for many years, since her first year at the university, and she has always been engaged in the monetary issues. So we have arrived at the final step in her long-term study. So that's a high-level research this time. I believe that her research is worthy of the highest grade. The candidate really takes a creative approach to research work. When she answers a question, this is a really substantiated and well thought out answer. She is very thoughtful as a researcher. I really believe that her research is well written, and the candidate deserves to be granted the academic degree in the economic theory 080001. Thank you. So now we have technical break. I would like everyone, except for the board members, to leave the hall.
Да. Так, все на местах, да? И можно...
Everyone is present. Our discussion didn't last for a long time. Our opinion is unanimous. We have all voted for. So 5 are for. So Margarita Repina is conferred the academic degree of the candidate of science. I'd like to point it out that this research work really confirms all the requirements, and what makes us even more pleased is that the research was conducted at a really high level. So I'd like to congratulate the candidate and to wish her all the best. Now you're welcome to give a few words as part of your closing speech. Thank you very much, the members of the Dissertation Board. I'm really pleased. It was a long way, so now it has reached its, well, so to say, logical conclusion. Thank you very much for the useful remarks. I will really do my best to consider them in my future research. So that was a long way, but that was a path full of joy. Every time you take up something new, and even if this is a difficult way, when learning something new, you really are on the path of self-development. I'd like to thank my father. I'd like to thank my research supervisor. This research wouldn't be possible without him, and I really hope to cooperate with you in future. Thank you. Thank you very much, dear colleagues. Now let's close the panel session.